My granddaughter is 8 years old. She rolled her eyes and said, "You can't sit with us. Mom said you're an old burden." The whole family at the table burst out laughing, including my son. I stood up and left silently. That same evening, he wrote to me, "Is the payment still due tomorrow?" I replied, "Figure it out yourself." The next morning, panic. Greetings, dear listeners. Before I begin telling this complicated story of my life, I ask you to support our channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and write in the comments which city you are listening from. This is very important for us. And now, enjoy listening. I never expected an ordinary Sunday dinner to shatter me. Not like this, not so completely. The house smelled of roasted chicken and herbs, a familiar scent that usually brought comfort, memories of family gatherings when laughter had been lighter, kinder. But today the aroma seemed sharp, almost acrid, like it was mocking me. I had been so careful, as always, arranging myself politely at the edge of the long, polished dining table, making sure the tablecloth was straight, that the silverware gleamed, that no one would find an excuse to criticize me. I had done all the small, invisible work that keeps a household running, the labor no one ever acknowledges. And yet, in a single cruel moment, all of it felt meaningless. Emma, my bright, mischievous little granddaughter with her untamed curls and wide brown eyes, looked at me as if I were already a ghost in the room. She didn't speak softly, or with the hesitation of a child unsure of boundaries. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and rolled her eyes and said, almost mechanically, "You can't sit with us. Mom said you're an old burden." The words were ice water sliding down my spine. They struck in layers, the sting of the child's bluntness, the betrayal implicit in my son's acquiescence, the casual cruelty of my daughter-in-law's influence. I felt my stomach seize, my chest tighten, and a tremor ripple through my hands. My fork hovered halfway to my mouth and then clattered onto the plate with a hollow, accusing sound. For a long, suspended second, I couldn't breathe. The room tilted, the walls pressing inward, the familiar ceiling above me seeming suddenly foreign, almost hostile. Then the laughter came. It wasn't the easy, shared laughter of a family enjoying a story or a joke. It was sharp, biting, a chorus of amusement at my expense. My son, Michael, laughed the hardest, the loudest, the sound reverberating off the walls like a hammer striking iron. I could see the glint of amusement in his eyes, the subtle curl of a smirk that said I was nothing, a relic, unworthy of their time or consideration. My daughter-in-law's laughter followed, pitched high, a sound that cut through my chest. Even the cousins, the teenagers sprawled lazily at the table, joined in, their amusement bright and unself-conscious, ignorant of the weight of their cruelty. I felt a sharp knot of humiliation tighten in my throat. I wanted to speak. I wanted to demand respect, to remind them of the years I had poured into this family, the sacrifices made silently, the nights I had stayed awake tending scraped knees, homework, heartbreaks they would never remember. I wanted to tell them, I am the bones and the mortar of this family. Without me, you wouldn't have the comfort you take for granted. But no sound came out. My voice had betrayed me before it had the chance to form, replaced instead by a hollow, freezing emptiness that pooled in my stomach. I tried to make myself smaller, as if that could somehow erase the moment, the words, the judgment. I pressed my palms against my thighs under the table, wishing I could dissolve into the fabric of the tablecloth, into the shadow cast by the chandelier above. My heart hammered against my ribs, wild and urgent, and yet the laughter continued, relentless, a tidal wave of derision. Every chuckle and giggle sank deeper into my bones, a reminder that this was not a passing sting, but a deliberate communal dismissal. I felt my mind fracture into shards of disbelief. How could Michael, my son, the boy I had raised with tenderness and care, the man who once brought me flowers simply to see me smile, find it so amusing to see me humiliated? The thought of his laughter, bright and mocking, tore at my chest, leaving raw, aching threads of grief and rage intertwined. I remembered the years spent smoothing over family conflicts, mediating fights, offering counsel that was often ignored, and suddenly all that labor seemed to have been a ticket to a place of mockery. The air around me seemed to thicken, every word from the table a drop of molten metal settling on my skin. I could feel the weight of their eyes, contemptuous, indifferent, amused, pinning me to my chair. My mind flickered with memories of quieter times, when Emma would cling to my hand in the park, when Michael would call me just to talk about nothing at all. It was as if those memories were from someone else's life, a life that had been quietly erased by a single damning sentence. I stood up, slowly, deliberately, letting my chair scrape against the floor, the sound loud in the stunned silence that followed my movement. I did not speak. I did not demand recognition, nor did I plead. I walked away silently, each step measured, carrying the full weight of the humiliation with me. My chest felt tight, raw emotion pressed against my ribs, but I held my head high enough to keep the tears from spilling, at least in front of them. The kitchen doorway opened before me like a threshold to exile, and I passed through it, leaving behind the laughter of the cruelty and the faces that had once been the center of my world. My pride was shattered, scattered like glass across the polished wooden floor of the dining room, and I could only move forward into the quiet darkness of the hall, wondering if I would ever feel at home at that table again. In the privacy of my bedroom, I closed the door behind me with a deliberate firmness that rattled the frame, a sound meant to separate me from the laughter that still lingered in my ears. I leaned against the door for a long moment, feeling the cool wood press into my back, grounding me while the storm of emotion surged inside. Hatred simmered, not for Emma, who was only 8, whose eyes had barely learned the shape of malice, but for the family that had found such pleasure in humiliating me, the grown adult who had chosen cruelty as amusement. Michael, my own son, the boy I had nurtured, taught, and guided, had joined in with abandon, his laughter rising above all others like a banner of betrayal. I could feel it in my chest, a dark weight pressing down, an anchor made of disappointment and disbelief. How could they treat me like this? How could they look at the person who had carried them, protected them, and contributed silently to their comfort, and see only a source of mockery? I sank slowly onto the edge of my bed, the mattress yielding under the sudden weight of my body. My hands gripped the sheets as if they were the last remnants of control, as if their coarse threads could anchor me in the sea of rage and humiliation swirling through me. The room was silent, but the echoes of the dining room were deafening. Every laugh replayed in my mind, sharp, relentless, punctuating the memory of Emma's words. "You can't sit with us. Mom said you're an old burden." Those words were lodged in me now, a splinter beneath the skin, impossible to remove, raw and throbbing. I tried to breathe, slow, measured breaths, telling myself to calm down, to let the anger dissolve before it consumed me. But every inhale brought a sharper pang, and every exhale carried the bitter taste of resentment. My heart raced with the memory of the table, the polished surface reflecting faces I thought I knew, but had now revealed themselves as strangers. I closed my eyes and saw Michael smirk again, the way he had leaned back in his chair with that casual, confident cruelty, as if my pain were a sideshow meant to entertain. It was unbearable, and yet it fueled a fire that burned steadily, quietly, beneath my skin. I remembered the years of my life spent smoothing over conflicts, offering counsel that went unheeded, providing meals, comfort, and guidance that no one ever acknowledged. Each unrecognized sacrifice now felt like fuel for the hatred simmering inside me. The quiet nights I had spent worrying over my children, the long hours ensuring bills were paid and deadlines met, the careful attention to holidays, birthdays, and the mundane rhythm of family life. It all seemed to vanish under a single pointed declaration from a child who had learned the worst of family dynamics before she even knew how to tie her shoes. My contributions, my presence, my love, they had been reduced to a punchline. I pressed my forehead against the cool wood of the nightstand, willing myself to feel something other than the gnawing sting of humiliation. The anger was not just personal. It was principled, righteous, a judgment against the way they had collectively trivialized me, dismissed me, erased me in front of one another. It was a slow, deliberate sort of anger, simmering beneath the surface, tightening my muscles and sharpening my awareness. I could feel it in the tension of my jaw, in the heat that radiated from my chest to my fingertips, in the way my knees pressed together like I was bracing myself against the tidal wave of emotions. I hated the laughter, yes, but I hated more that they had made it so easy, so unthinking, so casual. I hated that Michael had not only allowed it, but participated with such glee, as if the mother who had carried him through illness, celebrated his successes, and endured his adolescence was disposable, a source of amusement. And yet, beneath that hatred, there was a pulse of clarity, a recognition that this was no longer about me proving anything to them. This was about acknowledgement, the slow, quiet understanding that respect is not given lightly, and that every action carries a consequence, even if it is invisible in the moment. I sat back on the bed, my hands resting on my lap, and let the silence settle around me like a second skin. The anger was no longer sharp and sudden. It had become deliberate, methodical, a coiled spring within me. I replayed the scene in my mind, each laugh, each glance, each word, storing them carefully. Not for vengeance yet, not for confrontation, but to remember, to measure, to understand the depth of their disregard. The seething was not fleeting. It was a slow, controlled awareness that the balance of power had shifted, or at least, that it was time for me to recognize my own strength in the face of their callousness. I stared at the wall, letting the shadows of the evening stretch long across the room, my heart still pounding, my mind still racing. Hatred simmered, yes, but beneath it, there was a current of something more profound, something that whispered I was still here, that I still mattered, and that the pain they inflicted would not define the limits of my dignity. I would endure. I would exist, and when the time came, I would remind them, not with loud accusations, but with quiet, undeniable presence, that I had never been, and would never be, a burden. I sat in the dim glow of the living room, the single lamp casting elongated shadows across the walls, when my phone buzzed. The sudden vibration startled me, and for a moment my heart skipped a beat, not from anticipation, but from an instinctive sense that anything from Michael at this hour carried more than the casual weight of a son checking in. I reached for the device with slow, deliberate movements, the leather of the armchair pressing cold against my thighs, the silence of the house amplifying each sound. When I unlocked the screen, the message read simply, "Is the payment still due tomorrow?" I froze, the words suspended in the air like a trap. My fingers tightened around the phone, the knuckles blanching from the sudden force. That loan, that unspoken tension that had festered between us for years. Money I had lent to my son decades ago, when he was struggling to get his business off the ground, when I had believed in him without reservation, had been repaid only in fragments, with vague promises and the occasional thoughtful gesture that did little to erase the ledger of obligation. Every reminder now carried a double weight, the debt itself and the invisible ledger of emotional labor I had invested in him, the sacrifices, the silent nights worrying over bills and responsibilities that he had barely acknowledged. My chest tightened, the ache spreading to my shoulders and jaw. I stared at the message for what felt like an eternity, replaying every moment I had spent helping him, every day I had devoted to family without complaint, and the stark contrast of his casual assumption that I would continue to bend to his demands. The thought that he could reduce years of care, guidance, and financial support to a simple transaction, a line item in his mental accounting, filled me with a mix of fury and despair that settled in my stomach like a stone. And then, without thinking, without filtering the emotion that burned through me like liquid fire, I typed back, "Figure it out yourself." The words seemed impossibly small on the screen, 3 short words carrying the weight of decades. My thumb hovered over send for a heartbeat, trembling slightly, as if uncertain that a simple action could embody such deliberate force. And yet, in that moment, I felt the release of something I had carried far too long, the quiet, unacknowledged power of a boundary drawn in inkless permanence. The screen glowed silently in the seconds that followed, the cursor blinking at me like a heartbeat, a metronome counting out the gravity of my defiance. I did not know if Michael understood the weight of my words, whether he sensed the underlying warning, the decades of patience and endurance compressed into a single stinging directive. I imagined him reading it, pausing, feeling that slight, uncomfortable hesitation that comes when a person realizes they have overstepped, that the world they have assumed is theirs to manipulate has limits they have not yet tested. I placed the phone down on the table, my hands resting on either side, and leaned back into the chair, closing my eyes. The room felt simultaneously smaller and wider, the lamp's light tracing the contours of the walls, highlighting the dust motes that floated lazily in the air. Each particle seemed suspended in time, a witness to the subtle shift taking place in our relationship. For years, I had been the accommodating mother, the patient grandmother, the person who swallowed indignities and smiled politely. For the first time in decades, I had allowed the balance to tip, ever so slightly in my favor, and the sensation was intoxicating. And yet, beneath the satisfaction, there was a deeper layer of unease. I could feel the tension coiling in my chest, a mix of anticipation and dread. How would he respond? Would he finally grasp the implications of my words, or would he dismiss them as a fleeting moment of irritation? I pictured the possibilities, the anger, the confusion, the recognition of boundaries, and realized that the silence now stretching between us carried more potential than any conversation I had ever forced. The unspoken threat, the reminder that I was not infinitely pliable, resonated more powerfully than confrontation ever could. I traced the rim of my coffee cup absently, the ceramic smooth under my fingertips, focusing on the rhythm of my breathing, the slow inhalations and deliberate exhalations that reminded me I still controlled something in this house, in this family, in this life. The phone lay quiet before me, inert yet alive, a conduit of messages, authority, and consequence. Each second of silence was a measured victory, each pulse a reminder that I had reclaimed a piece of agency that had long been eroded by habit, expectation, and unacknowledged service. I did not allow myself to anticipate the outcome, to speculate too wildly. Instead, I sat in the subtle power of the moment, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a boundary drawn, a statement made, a voice raised, not in volume, but in clarity. The text had been sent. The message was clear. I was no longer a silent participant in the ledger of obligations. I had reminded my family that respect, like any currency, could not be assumed, could not be taken for granted. I could feel the shift, subtle, undeniable, vibrating beneath the surface of the ordinary evening, and it was enough for now. The night stretched long, heavy, and unyielding. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, the fan above moving in slow, rhythmic circles that seemed to echo the pulse of my own restless thoughts. Shadows shifted in the corners of the room, elongated by the soft glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds, and each tiny movement drew my gaze, forcing me to confront the quiet unease that had settled in my chest. Sleep was a stranger. My body felt exhausted, but my mind refused the surrender of rest. It wandered, circling questions and consequences like a hawk above prey. I thought of Michael's message again, the terse, demanding line that had appeared on my screen like a challenge. Is the payment still due tomorrow? My reply had been immediate, unthinking, but beneath that impulse was a simmering current of satisfaction I hadn't allowed myself in decades. Yet satisfaction is a delicate thing, fragile and taunting, and the weight of its presence only magnified the anticipation. I imagined the fallout, the ripple of recognition that could follow, the subtle tremors of unease as the universe, or fate, adjusted to the truth I had always known, that respect is earned, not borrowed, and sometimes it takes years for the balance to settle. I turned onto my side, curling slightly into the familiar contours of the quilt. I could feel the cold edge of reality pressing against the warmth of anticipation, a strange duality that made my chest tighten and release in uneven rhythms. What if my defiance had consequences I could not foresee? I had spent years protecting myself from such moments, swallowing discomforts, absorbing slights, masking hurt with a polite smile. And now the silence between my words and Michael's world felt like a fault line, waiting for the inevitable tremor. The thought prickled at the base of my skull. One wrong move, one misjudgment, and the quiet satisfaction might become chaos. I listened to the house, the usual nighttime sounds, creaks in the floorboards, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional murmur of a passing car outside, seemed magnified. Each sound was an omen, or so my imagination whispered. Every tiny noise became a signal, a potential harbinger of the events I had set into motion with a single text. My pulse accelerated, then slowed, as if the night itself were breathing with me, synchronizing to my apprehension. The tension was not loud. It was subtle, suffocating in its intimacy. And yet, amid the unease, there was something else. A spark, almost imperceptible but undeniably present, glimmered in the edges of my mind. Anticipation. The kind of anticipation I had not felt since my children were small, when the weight of responsibility and love was constant, but unspoken. Now the anticipation was selfish, focused inward, a thrill of watching what might come next, of sensing the universe leaning ever so slightly toward balance. It was quiet, almost invisible, but it hummed beneath my skin, tugging at my nerves in a way that was both unnerving and exhilarating. I rolled back onto my back, staring at the ceiling fan again. Its rotation seemed slower than usual, deliberate, marking time in a rhythm that no human clock could replicate. I imagined the house itself holding its breath, waiting for acknowledgement, for the subtle tipping of scales that had been so long overdue. I pictured Michael, pacing in some room, phone in hand, irritation rising, awareness dawning. I pictured Emma, perhaps sensing tension she could not name, shifting uneasily in the quiet, the atmosphere thick with unspoken currents. Even the walls seemed to hum with expectation, the air heavy, charged with the invisible weight of accountability. The hours passed in a stretch of tense stillness. I counted breaths, imagined the slow turning of the sun, and watched the shadows migrate across the room with the precision of a clock. Time felt elastic, stretching in response to my heightened awareness, expanding and contracting with each imagined consequence, each flicker of thought that leaped to life like a moth to a flame. There was no relief, no lull, only the continuous, unbroken tension that made each moment feel both infinite and fleeting at once. Eventually, the first tendrils of sunlight found their way past the blinds. The beams fell across the quilt and onto the floor in thin, gold lines, cutting through the darkness with quiet insistence. I lay still beneath the faint warmth, my eyes following the light as it edged across the walls, across the familiar contours of the room I had inhabited for decades. In that fragile illumination, I felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration, of dread and hope, as though the world itself had paused, holding its breath for what was to come. The house remained silent, the shadows receding reluctantly, and in that stillness, I understood something fundamental. Anticipation is its own kind of power, and in that power, even the smallest act, an unthinking text, a simple refusal, can tilt the world ever so subtly in one's favor. I did not move, did not speak, did not even reach for the phone. I only watched the sunlight, measured my pulse, and let the quiet tension stretch, unbroken, over me. For the first time in a long time, I felt that I was no longer entirely subject to the expectations of others. The scales, unseen and unacknowledged, were beginning to shift. And though sleep had eluded me, I felt a strange, steady strength in the awareness that what comes next would not find me unprepared. By 7 a.m., the phone's insistent buzzing had become a storm. I lay in bed, half drained of energy from a night spent wide-eyed, and the persistent vibrations against the wooden nightstand pulled me into wakefulness with an almost physical jolt. The screen lit up, each notification more urgent than the last, a cascade of digital chaos that refused to be ignored. Michael. Over and over, his name flashed in jagged red letters, accompanied by snippets of messages that blurred together in a feverish torrent. The money, where is it? The bank, what's happening? I can't access anything. I stared, my chest tightening, my mind struggling to process the gravity of the situation. The words seemed unreal, a strange echo of the life I had known for decades, a life in which I had watched my own sacrifices overlooked, my efforts minimized, and my presence mocked. And now, here it was, the reversal, sharp and indisputable, a reckoning delivered not by confrontation, but by circumstance itself. I set the phone down for a moment, trying to measure the reality behind the frantic syllables and exclamation marks. Each message was a pulse, rapid and erratic, vibrating with panic. He had ignored deadlines, ignored the careful, deliberate rules of accountability, and now the universe, or perhaps some invisible arbiter of justice, was refusing to buffer his errors. I could almost hear the invisible scales tilting, the weight of years of irresponsibility pressing down on him in ways he had never imagined. I tried to suppress a shiver of something I had not allowed myself in decades, satisfaction. Not joy, not glee, but a quiet, measured recognition that life, in its inscrutable ways, sometimes balances itself when human hands fail to act. My heart beat unevenly, partly in disbelief, partly in anticipation. Michael had relied on me for support, for the invisible scaffolding that held his life upright, and now that scaffolding had been removed, or perhaps rearranged by some unseen hand. The panic in his messages was immediate, raw, and unrelenting, and I felt an almost imperceptible thrill in recognizing that the world, finally, was reflecting back the urgency he had so long ignored in my struggles. I sat up in bed, pulling the quilt around my shoulders. The room was quiet except for the persistent hum of the phone and the occasional rustle of blinds against the morning breeze. My thoughts were a tangle of memory and reflection, each one circling back to the way my family had treated me the day before, the laughter at dinner, Emma's harsh words, Michael's complicity. It was impossible not to draw a connection, to see the sharp symmetry between yesterday's humiliation and today's unfolding panic. I had been the observer, the target, the silent participant in their derision. Now, without effort on my part, the situation had reversed. I picked up the phone again, swiping through the messages, each more frantic than the last. There was a jagged intensity in them, the kind of desperation that comes only when someone realizes they are not in control, when the familiar certainty of life's conveniences disappears overnight. I could almost hear his voice trembling through the digital text, a vibration of anxiety that was alien, unsettling, yet impossible to ignore. His reliance on me, his assumption that I would always fill in the gaps of his irresponsibility, had been a constant shadow over our relationship. And now that shadow had shifted, leaving him exposed. Despite the initial shock, I noticed a strange calm settling over me. My breathing slowed, my pulse moderated, and for the first time in hours I felt a measure of clarity. The panic on the other end of the line was absolute. There was no negotiating with it, no rationalizing away the consequences. Every message was a mirror, reflecting the vulnerability that comes from a lifetime of privilege taken for granted. And though I felt a flicker of vindication, it was tempered by something older, deeper, the recognition that life's lessons are harsh, impartial, and often delayed, but undeniable when they arrive. I stayed in bed, phone in hand, scrolling and reading, feeling a peculiar blend of disbelief, apprehension, and a restrained sense of triumph. I did not respond. I did not intercede. There was a power in silence, and watching the tide of consequences crash upon someone who had long relied on the tide to carry him without effort. I allowed myself to observe, to measure, to witness the impact of a reckoning that had taken decades to manifest, yet arrived in the most astonishingly simple way. A day that demanded attention, a world that refused to bend to entitlement. Minutes stretched, heavy and taut, and with each ping of the phone, I felt a subtle but undeniable shift inside me. The panic was unrelenting, and the realization that I was no longer powerless, that I could stand back and watch events unfold without being consumed by them, settled like a stone in my chest. I understood that this moment, this tense, unbroken hour of frantic messages, was not merely a reversal of roles. It was an awakening, a reminder that time has a way of enforcing accountability, that the scales, though often delayed, always seek balance. By the time sunlight fully spilled into the room, turning the walls golden warm, I was still seated, the phone resting lightly in my hand. I felt neither elation nor cruelty, only a profound awareness of the power of patience, the inevitability of consequence, and the quiet, steady knowledge that sometimes the universe itself becomes the instrument of justice. I did not speak. I did not act. I simply observed, and in that observation, I felt the subtle, undeniable satisfaction of watching the scales finally tip. I didn't reply. I sat at the small kitchen table, My hands wrapped around the warmth of a coffee mug and let the storm of his panic rage across my phone screen without interference. Each new message was more frantic than the last, a frantic testament to the chaos he had sown and now could not control. There was something almost hypnotic about the way the words tumbled out, half demands, half pleas, all tinged with the fear of imminent consequence. My chest, once tight with lingering shame from yesterday, now felt light. A subtle, almost imperceptible warmth spread through me, a balm formed not from malice, but from the quiet satisfaction of witnessing accountability arrive in its own strange, relentless way. The morning sunlight slanted through the blinds, painting stripes of gold across the floor, and for a moment the house seemed suspended between ordinary domesticity and some surreal, larger-scale justice. Emma, my granddaughter, appeared quietly in the doorway. Her eyes were wide, curious, a mixture of confusion and fascination. She did not speak. She did not approach. She simply watched me, as if she had already sensed that the air around the table carried a weight she could not yet understand. I met her gaze briefly and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. There was recognition in that gesture, a silent communication that the world, sometimes cruel, sometimes capricious, could also correct itself. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the bitter warmth anchor me. The taste reminded me of years I had spent filling roles others assumed would always be mine, the dutiful mother, the accommodating grandmother, the quiet provider of unspoken labor. And yet, all those roles had not protected me from humiliation. They had not shielded me from the sting of laughter, from Emma's innocent cruelty, or Michael's thoughtless betrayal. But now, as I watched him unravel from a distance, I felt a profound shift. Power had returned to me, not through confrontation, not through speech, not through the drama of argument, but through observation. The world itself had become the instrument of the lesson he had never learned. Messages continued to flood in, more fragmented, more desperate, each one betraying a mind unaccustomed to sudden, uncompromising disorder. I don't understand. It's all frozen. Why can't I access the account? I need the money. Now. The raw, unpolished panic seeped from each word. I allowed myself a quiet acknowledgement of it, a recognition that this was the inevitable outcome of years spent prioritizing convenience over responsibility, reliance over accountability. It was a natural, almost poetic justice, delivered without me needing to speak, act, or intervene. I could feel a faint smile tug at the corners of my mouth. Not a cruel smile, never that, but a quiet, private smile born from relief and clarity. Relief that I no longer bore the brunt of scorn, clarity that the universe, patient and impartial, had finally manifested consequences he could no longer ignore. In that small moment, I felt the heaviness of yesterday, the humiliation, the laughter, the shame, fade like mist in the morning sun. The memory of being called an old burden still lingered, sharp and bitter, but it no longer had the power to wound. It had been replaced by a quiet recognition. The balance had shifted, and I was free to witness without interference, to observe without fear. Emma moved slightly, stepping a little closer, her small fingers gripping the edge of the doorframe. Her eyes flickered to the phone in my hand, and then to me, and in that glance I saw curiosity, maybe even the faintest trace of comprehension. She did not fully understand the situation, nor did she need to. Children often witness lessons incompletely, but the impression she carried, of consequence of cause and effect, of respect earned and ignored, was enough. I felt a surge of protective satisfaction, not for myself alone, but for the possibility that she would carry this quiet understanding forward, that she might see the difference between laughter that destroys and awareness that corrects. I turned my gaze back to the phone, watching the messages cascade like a river swollen beyond its banks, and felt a steady, calming rhythm in the chaos. Michael's panic was urgent, raw, and inescapable. Every attempt at control, every frantic demand, fell short. The lesson was absolute, and it required nothing from me but patience and observation. I felt neither glee nor triumph. What I felt was far subtler, far deeper, a warm, resonant sense of justice unfolding on its own terms. The kitchen was silent, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional chirp of a text notification. I remained seated, coffee in hand, observing the quiet unraveling of entitlement and the slow, unyielding arrival of consequence. Outside, sunlight spilled across the yard, illuminating the ordinary world in extraordinary clarity. In that clarity I understood something profound. Being ignored, dismissed, laughed at, these were not the end of me. They were merely preludes to a moment like this, where the scales finally found balance, and I could witness it without fear, without malice, and without interruption. I set the coffee cup down with deliberate care and exhaled slowly, the morning air filling my lungs with calm certainty. The messages continued to arrive, urgent, frantic, insistent, but they were no longer mine to solve. The chaos belonged to him. The lesson belonged to the universe. And I, at last, belonged to myself. By evening, the house had settled into a strange, almost fragile calm. The frenzy of the morning, the endless pinging of my phone, the frantic barrage of texts, the rising panic in Michael's tone, had ebbed into an uneasy stillness. The remnants of chaos lingered in the corners of the house, subtle but undeniable. A quiet tension that filled the rooms, the faint hum of electronics that no longer obeyed commands so readily, a trace of the universe's quiet insistence that rules, once ignored, cannot remain so indefinitely. I observed it all with a sense of detachment, a clarity that comes after storms have passed, when the air is still but charged with the memory of turbulence. Michael had begun repairing some of the damage, restoring access to accounts, reversing hasty errors, untangling the financial knots that had ensnared him. His fingers moved over the keyboard with an unsteady precision, a nervous efficiency that betrayed a mind still trembling from earlier panic. But he did not apologize. He did not attempt to justify, excuse, or charm his way out of the lesson he had received. Instead, there was something subtler, a careful, respectful distance, the avoidance of casual disrespect, a pause before he spoke or acted, as if he had finally internalized that his actions, those he had long assumed were without consequence, carried weight. It was an uneasy truce, but it was a truce nonetheless, and it was earned. I sank deeper into my chair, the fabric worn under my hands, the coffee long gone cold beside me, and allowed myself to savor the quiet victory. It was not the kind of triumph that demanded applause or recognition. There were no dramatic declarations, no verbalized "I told you so." There was only the subtle shift in energy around the house, a palpable respect that had emerged organically, born out of accountability rather than coercion. Yesterday I had been a burden in their eyes, a figure of ridicule, a subject for amusement. Today I was seen differently, not through words, but through the undeniable consequences that had unfolded. Emma lingered nearby, as curious as ever, though far more subdued. Her presence reminded me that lessons extend beyond immediate recipients. Children absorb subtleties, the unspoken language of cause and effect, the quiet authority of those who have endured and observed. I caught her eyes darting toward me, bright and inquisitive, and felt a protective pride. Not because of the turmoil Michael had faced, but because she had witnessed a form of justice that did not rely on anger, harsh words, or spectacle. The lesson was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was indelible. I reflected on the nature of power and patience, on the strange and delicate ways in which justice can manifest. For decades, I had lived in the shadows of others' expectations, bending, giving, absorbing, and enduring. I had raised Michael, supported him, sacrificed in ways that were never acknowledged or reciprocated. And yet, I had never truly understood the quiet, almost imperceptible potency of waiting, of observing, of allowing the natural consequences of neglect and entitlement to unfold without interference. There is a particular satisfaction in witnessing accountability arrive without your hands guiding it, a satisfaction that is far deeper, far more enduring than the shallow gratification of confrontation. I inhaled slowly, feeling the tension drain from my shoulders. The weight of yesterday's humiliation, the sting of laughter and casual cruelty, no longer held dominion over my thoughts. In its place was a calm, measured awareness. I had reclaimed dignity, not by force, not by argument, not by pleading, but by endurance and the quiet patience to allow reality itself to deliver the reckoning. Michael had been given the full measure of the consequences he had long ignored, and in that process I had been restored, not publicly, not dramatically, but irrevocably in the only way that matters, internally, in the steadiness of my own heart, in the certainty that respect, once denied, had finally been acknowledged. The evening air drifted through the slightly open window, carrying the faint scent of the garden outside, the lingering warmth of a sun reluctant to leave the sky. I sat with my hands folded, listening to the subtle hum of domestic life that now seemed tinged with a new awareness, a quiet tension that suggested understanding without need for verbalization. Michael moved about the house with caution. Emma observed without interruption, and I felt the rare, almost intoxicating pleasure of watching balance restored without uttering a single word. I allowed a small, private smile to form, a smile born not of malice, not of triumph over another's misfortune, but of recognition. Yesterday I was mocked, dismissed, deemed a burden. Today, without shouting, without confrontation, without spectacle, I had reminded my family that actions carry consequences, that respect is not given lightly, and that the universe, in its subtle, patient way, has a way of listening. The power I felt was quiet but absolute, an internal triumph that no laughter, no insult, no disregard could ever erase. I leaned back, letting the weight of it settle, and for the first time in years I felt entirely, unshakably restored.